Now, if you're at all into film reviews, film history, or anything in regards to queer history, or in particular queer coding, you have heard of the Hays Code. But what did the Hays Code do for disability representation? That's what we're gonna find out today, because I've been wondering for a while and I don't like having questions left unanswered, and it's partially why I created a YouTube channel, so that I could answer those questions and have an excuse to go down weird little rabbit holes. But before we do that, I need to introduce myself. Hello, my dears. My name is Sydney. My pronouns are they, them. I'm an openly queer, disabled, autistic, trans, non-binary actor, composer, educator, media analyst, and disability advocate, currently working on a thesis about disability education, media, theater, performance, accessible education, and basically anything else in any and all of those categories, and it's culminating in the world's first all-neurodivergent casting crew production of The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime. You can learn all about all of that in the links in the description, and I am a white person in their early 20s with shoulder-length, light brown curly hair. I am wearing a white undershirt and a open button-up that has volcanoes and lava on it, and you can't really totally tell from the screen, but I'm covered in volcanoes because I'm a nerd. Anyway, let's talk about the Hays Code. We're gonna start with a brief history of film and how we got to the point of censorship even being a thing, and then we're gonna go over what the code actually said, because I read it, and then how that affected queer representation as well as disabled representation. I learned a lot researching for this, and I'm really excited to share it with you. So, first of all, we have a little film history for you. Film as a concept and also as a possibility became a thing in the 1890s with various tools in various different places being invented around the same time. In 1896, we see our first scandal with an 18-second film called The Kiss, one of the very first films ever shown commercially to the public that, you guessed it, by the title was a kiss scene. And people saw that and immediately went, this film thing is gonna corrupt our souls and our children and we need to regulate it, just like from day one from an 18-second movie. And as film gained popularity in the US, there were some censorship rules put in place state by state for some like hyper-specific situations, but censorship overall was pretty chill, as chill as censorship can be, which I don't... Anyway, arguably, no. That was the general vibe. And then in 1915, a Supreme Court case ruled that motion pictures were purely commerce and not an art, and therefore not covered by the First Amendment. Which is, if you're not American, that's the free speech amendment, that we can say whatever we want without problem or censorship. So that basically meant that there was nothing legally stopping governments and censorship boards from editing or banning films altogether. Meanwhile, as films were getting more popular and the First World War took place and people were trying to process that through their art, films went in many different directions. And one of those directions was German Expressionism, which brought us films such as The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. I've never seen it, I don't know if that's how that's pronounced. Nosferatu and Metropolis, all of which are very cool and very interesting and very important, and also very dark, and kind of mostly handle things like madness and insanity and all the various things that go along with madness and insanity. There were also a lot of scandals going on in the film industry at the same time, including some murder and some adultery and whatnot, as one would expect from early Hollywood or just like current Hollywood. But you see, in 1921, in response to all of this stuff, there was an uptick in censorship rules. Over 100 were passed in just that one year, that varied state by state and county by county. Those were ever changing, and they made things very difficult for movie studios because they wanted to obviously make the maximum profit and they couldn't cater their films to every single one of these individual rules. So in 1922, studios decided self-regulation was probably a better plan before like government censorship came in. And so William H. Hays, former Postmaster General and head of the Republican National Committee, why did they choose this man, was hired to be the president of the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America. In 1924, he created a general formula of some light rules to follow and asked that producers submit the plots of their movies to his office for approval. In 1927, he teamed up with heads of major production companies. There's like it was like the big five, and then there's a couple other ones that were smaller and underneath them. And he worked with them to create a list of guidelines called the Don'ts and Be Carefuls, based on items most often challenged by censor boards around the country. However, many film people completely and entirely ignored those rules because they had absolutely no way of enforcing them. They were just guidelines. Now, around the same time, the editor for a film industry trade paper and a priest came up with their own set of moral guidelines based on Catholic morals that they sent to major motion picture companies in 1929. Everybody basically combined this new code with the old code to make a slightly stricter code. And then we saw the Great Depression begin with the stock market crash in August 1929, and film companies needed to figure out how to fill their seats and how to sell tickets because they still wanted money, because capitalism. And they did that by putting a whole lot of really wild stuff on screen, which there were censorship codes in place, but they didn't really do anything to stop that. So the Catholic Church took matters into their own hands, because yes, the Catholic Church gets involved here. So in 1933, the Roman Catholic Church pops in and they create the Legion of Decency with their own rating system based on their own Catholic decency rules, where they publish ratings for every film. And like in regular mass every week, they had people pledge on their souls that they would not attend motion pictures that were deemed unholy by the church because it would corrupt their moral souls or whatever. And given that Catholics made up about 10% of the US population at the time, that was a death sentence for the film industry. Like, for sure, if there were mass boycotts, they were screwed. So they decided, you know what? We're gonna take control with our censorship stuff. So they formed the Production Code Administration, or the PCA, which finalized these guidelines and to make them stricter, and then it required that all films from all production companies pass through them before the films get made. The office was run by Joseph I. Breen, a devout Catholic, and it took in every single movie script, every costume plan, every advertisement. They went through those line by line and sent their notes and critiques back to movie studios, production companies, directors, actors, etc. Every single thing to come out of Hollywood from 1934 to 1948, and most stuff from 1948 to the early 60s, but it got a little sketchy. We'll talk about that in a bit. Went through the hands of this office, and specifically the hands of this one guy. And because all of the movie theaters in the United States were owned by the major production companies, every film shown commercially in the US during this time very strictly adhered to these Hays Code standards. But isn't that a monopoly over the entire film industry, which is kind of an issue? Absolutely it is. And in 1948, the Supreme Court ruled on that, saying that the major movie studios had violated antitrust laws and required that they sell all of their theaters. And that meant that independent and European films started to show up in these theaters, and those films were not required to follow the standards set by the Hays Code because they were not made through that pathway, and that started to weaken the power of the PCA. Then in 1952, the Supreme Court overturned their 1915 ruling on film and free speech, allowing censorship of obscene films and censorship under narrow authority, but it was another big blow to the Hays Code, obviously. And then in 1965, another Supreme Court decision, Friedman versus Maryland, ruled that prior restraint of film exhibition without a court order was unconstitutional, effectively killing the Hays Code altogether. In 1967, they replaced that code with the Motion Picture Association of America film rating system thing that we have today. For the record, our current like PG, R, that system, whatever, it's super flawed and elitist and controlled by too few people. I think this is still a major problem. It's better than straight up censorship, but it's still a messy system that really needs an overhaul. That's a discussion for another day. But in my research on this topic, I saw some interesting arguments and discussions either way about the Hays Code, particularly how once the code lost control over films, the portrayal of women as sex objects went absolutely way up, as did the unnecessary and unchecked sexualization of children. And there are also discussions from Golden Age filmmakers about how, sure, this code sucked, but it also helped them with their creativity in trying to figure out how to work around it, which I also understand, but then at the same time think of all of the great films that were never made because of these censorship rules. And like, I'm not here to defend censorship, though the line between censorship and regulation is very thin. That's not what today's video is about. Just throwing some ideas, some things to think about. Maybe you can say some stuff in the comments about how you feel about this. I don't know. You do you. Just wanted to bring up some talking points there. Let's talk about the Hays Code. Now, I've seen a lot of videos talking about this code and only mentioning a small piece of the things in it, and I always wondered what the rest of it had to say. So I read the whole thing, and I'm gonna summarize it for you rather than just say the 3 things we hear about in every single Hays Code video, because I think that it's interesting to know where our film history comes from, even the like things that we see as benign and like unimportant had big effects on the media that we see. So I'm gonna be ignoring the weird essays at the beginning and the end of the Hays Code explaining the reasons as to why we need to have strict morals in the media and our duty to humanity or whatever. You can read those on your own time. They don't really matter. So once you get past the first little preachy bit, you get to the actual list of things. The first section being the general principles that all other guidelines fall underneath. But if there isn't a guideline for a specific situation, they can use these as backup to still stop things. So principle number 1 says, no picture shall be produced which will lower the moral standards of those who see it. Hence, the sympathy of the audience shall never be thrown to the side of crime, wrongdoing, evil, or sin. So basically, we should never side with the bad guy or the even remotely bad guy or the guy who does anything remotely unmoral. So yeah. Number 2 states, correct standards of life, subject only to the requirements of drama and entertainment, shall be presented. Basically the same thing, cover some other situations. And then number 3 says, law, natural or human, shall not be ridiculed, nor shall sympathy be created for its violation. Which is, again, the same sentiment. So I guess they really just had to spell that out for us 3 times in a row. Good for them, I guess. From there, we get into the general rules that I've summarized or just copied word for word here, depending on the thing. So, Here we go. Any sort of crime must be presented in a way, if necessary at all, that will not inspire imitation or be explicitly presented, and brutal killings are not to be presented in detail. Revenge in modern times shall not be justified. I think this means that if it's like a justified revenge, like an ancient Greek story that you can't change, that's okay, but generally try to avoid it. The use of liquor in American life when not required by the plot or for proper characterization will not be shown. This also includes drunk people. Drunk people are not allowed on screen unless there's a very specific reason for it. Drug addiction or the illicit traffic in addiction producing drugs shall not be shown if the portrayal justifies their use, makes it seem positive, makes it seem like an easily broken habit, shows the drugs being taken or procured, or involves children doing any of these things. Stories on kidnapping or illegal abduction of children are only acceptable when it's handled with restraint and discretion and the child is returned unharmed. Excessive and inhuman acts of cruelty and brutality shall not be presented. This includes all detailed and protracted presentation of physical violence, torture, abuse. Oh, there was a section, I didn't write this down, there's a section specifically about how the third degree, if you're showing an interrogation scene, should be shown. Anyway, the sanctity of the institution of marriage and the home shall be upheld. Pictures shall not infer that low forms of sex relationship are the accepted or common thing. This is where we get the whole married couple sleep in 2 separate twin beds with a nightstand in the middle thing came from, because God forbid they even assume that a bed is big enough for a married couple to sleep in together, because we can't have that. Think of the children. We just can't have that. Adultery and illicit relations, if necessary to the plot, must not be explicitly treated, justified, or presented attractively. Scenes of passion, as they call them, can only be there if definitely essential to the plot and must be limited. I heard somewhere that there was like a 3-second maximum for kissing length in films. I could be wrong about that. Sex perversion or any inference to it is forbidden. Translation, no gay, just none, 0, gays are not allowed. If abortion is to be brought up, it shall be condemned and should never be treated lightly or made the subject of comedy. The word abortion shall not be used. Sex work, they did not use the word sex work, but I'm gonna say sex work, shall never be presented in detail, nor should the subjects be presented unless shown in contrast to right standards of behavior. Interracial relationships are forbidden. Also not how that was originally phrased. Scenes of actual childbirth in fact or in silhouette are never to be presented. This also includes just the existence of pregnant women. Just can't show that. Obscenity in word, gesture, reference, song, joke, or by suggestion, even when likely to be understood only by part of the audience, is forbidden. And then they go to have a giant list of all of the profane words that are not allowed to be used. I will put that on screen for you over here. My personal faves include hold your hat and the fact that you can't make jokes about toilets. Undressing scenes should be avoided and never used save where essential to the plot. Dances suggesting or representing sexual actions or indecent passion are forbidden, and dances which emphasize indecent movements are to be regarded as obscene. Then we have the religion section, which includes gems such as no film or episode may throw ridicule on any religious faith. Ministers of religion, in their character as ministers of religion, should not be used as comic characters or as villains, and ceremonies of any definite religion should be carefully and respectfully handled. There's also a section titled National Feelings that basically says everything about the country and historical people should be represented fairly and respectfully, which, given that it was exclusively white men who were approving all of these films, maybe that was a little skewed. I don't know, maybe just a little bit, just a thought, you know. There's also a section dictating what kinds of titles are okay and which kinds of titles are not okay, and a list of repellent subjects that must be treated within the careful limits of good taste. And one of the things on there that I found entertaining was surgical operations. Apparently those are not okay. So, but yeah, that's the Hays Code. And it explains a lot of the weird things we saw in Golden Age Hollywood, as well as the giant uptick in other things in the 70s and 80s in response to the falling of the code. Like, we saw so much like scenes of passion and we saw so much violence, and I think that uptick is because it suddenly became allowed. But let's talk about how the censorship program created queer coding as we know it today, because that's not exactly why we're here, but it's one of the reasons that we're here. Basically, the subtext of all of these weirdly specific rules is that if you show deviant or bad behavior in your film, that character cannot be rewarded for that behavior. Meaning that you can show deviant and bad behavior, that's not explicit or explicitly queer, if that character is a villain of some sort. So while they couldn't say, make an explicitly queer character, if queer creators wanted to make a character conform to queer stereotypes to be able to see themselves on film and kind of tell other people like, oi, we're back here making films, we see you, they could do that as long as it was a villain. And this was usually also very well received by non-queer audiences because there was so much discomfort around anything queer at the time that making your villains very queer-coded made them feel creepier and more unnerving. And that is also how we got every single Disney villain. Now you know. Also many other villainous characters throughout all other genres of film. But what I find interesting about this is inevitably the characters that are flawed and deviant and mess up that get the bad endings, the ones that the Hays Code tried to make us not want to emulate or even like in the slightest, those characters were actually the most interesting ones because they had depth and messiness. And sure, they were punished in the end, but they were so often the outcasts who were disillusioned by how the world was and tried to do something about it. And yes, they were made to offset the super clean and perfect main character who you're supposed to root for, but also that main character is very bland and boring, and the villains end up being way more entertaining and complicated and interesting in comparison to this bland and boring lead. So people grew to adore the messy characters too, if not more, which I think is really cool, and also a way that this code totally backfired on its own mission a little bit. But the original quest of this video was not where did queer coding come from, because there's an entire section of YouTube about that. Literally every video is about it. That's why I keep meaning to research this, because it keeps coming up on my feed. But my question is, knowing that we got queer coding from the censorship rules, what did this have to do with disability, and how did this affect disability representation in film? And I was really surprised sitting down to read the entire code. Like, I read it through a couple times because I couldn't find anything. Disability is never mentioned, which is interesting because if you look at disability film timelines, the quality and amount of representation follows a very similar track to that of queer representation. So what other factors could have influenced this? Because it's not explicitly in the code. And clearly disability was censored as well on some level, despite never being explicitly mentioned. And then made me go, what about disability history? Let me look back in disability history, and I remembered ugly laws. For those of you who are unfamiliar with disability history, which is valid, but you should learn about it, there were laws from the 1870s up until the last arrest and ultimate repeal of the law in 1974 that made it illegal for any person who is diseased, maimed, mutilated, or in any way deformed so as to be an unsightly or disgusting object or improper person to be allowed in or on the public ways or other public places in this city, or shall therein or thereon expose himself to public view. Meaning that anyone with a physical disability who could be seen on the street, if they were seen on the street, they could be fined, arrested, and or institutionalized. These laws also often targeted people of color and homeless people as well, but they're a large part of disability history in the United States, and why you didn't see disabled people for a long part of our history is because we literally couldn't leave our houses. And the reasoning behind these ugly laws usually has something to do with decency and the laws of human nature, and we must protect the children and whatnot because, you know, eugenics. But if we remember back to the general principles of the Hays Code, they said law, natural or human, shall not be ridiculed, nor shall sympathy be created for its violation. And generally the whole code decried anything seen as indecent. And you were told to avoid images of surgical operations or possible gruesomeness, all of which arguably probably applies to disability. Not to mention that disabled people were regularly referred to as freaks of nature, meaning that their existence in a movie would defy natural laws or whatever, and we just can't have that. We can't think of the children. Who's gonna think of the children? I couldn't find any specific statements in regards to that because most Hays Code stuff you find online talks about it in the realms of queerness. Like the vast majority of conversations are about queerness, but given that during approximately the same time period there were laws in place referring to disabled people as indecent for public view, that makes me think that in all likelihood that probably extended for film as well. Now, another thing that turns me toward this conclusion is we saw the biggest crackdown on films right at the start of the code in 1934. And this was 2 years after the film Freaks was released. Freaks is a weirdly perfect disability representation, and all of the freaks in the film are played by real physically disabled people who formerly or currently at the time of filming worked in freak shows. And there were stories about people feeling uncomfortable being on set with disabled people. There were stories of the test audiences not responding well to the film because they found it to be too grotesque. And it totally bombed at the box office, and it started a lot of conversations around censorship and what things should be allowed to be seen on screen, to the point where MGM ended up pulling the film from theaters before it could finish its expected run. So again, I'm really surprised they didn't have anything explicitly prohibiting visible disability in their code, just given the situation with freaks. But maybe they knew that would sound rude if they did that, so they just used other words to stop it in different ways. And I also think that either way, whether it was allowed by the Hays Code or not, the way that freaks went over with the public probably stopped movie makers from wanting to try to put disability on screen for a while anyway. But yeah, so I went through some lists about disability and disabled films during the Hays era to see what sort of representation there was at the time and see what I could find. And I found that nearly all of the disabled representation I could find fit within two categories. My first category was that the film is a remake of either an older film or an older film of an old novel or a remake of a novel into a film, where they couldn't really erase the disability because it was such a classic story, so they just smoothed it out. Examples being Heidi, A Christmas Carol, and there were like 3 different films about Helen Keller. And in nearly all of these stories, the disabled character is either the saintly victim, Helen Keller, or the angry old grandparent trope, or the villain trope, which is a version of that. And the disabilities were usually like, oh, they have a crutch, or ah, they sit in a wheelchair, and never anything too sensational, or just like typical for the majority of disabilities that we see. And then the second category of disability film I found was way too many films about World War II veterans coming home from the war and being so brave in the war and now trying to readjust to their new lives as disabled people, which is so clearly post-war propaganda that I don't think I need to directly state that. And in that case, given that it was pro-US propaganda, I'm pretty sure the censors wouldn't have much issue with that disability representation because it was positive for the country. So that's all I have. I truly thought I was going to dig up more fun information and more dirt on this topic, but this is truly all that I could find. So I would love to know your theories on this, particularly from people who are film buffs, who are super into film history. Please let me know in the comments. Feels really weird to just end a video without a very clear conclusion because I like tying things into little bows, but that's how this one ended up. So with that, thank you for listening. Thanks for learning. Remember, it's never too late to start over, and I look forward to seeing you, my dear, in the next one.